essay by William Clifford, I believe around 1880 or so is my guess, late 19th century. I don't think Clifford was a professional philosopher. That was his thing. I think he was a scientist, but I'm not really sure. Anyway, I chose it because it's referenced in William James's essay as something that he has a very high respect for, but ultimately thinks is mistaken. But I thought we would give it a look, and it's quite an interesting essay. It's called The Ethics of Belief, and that's quite interesting. When we talk about ethics, we're talking about what's right and wrong, what's good and bad. The ethics of belief. It's certainly not belief about ethics. It's not our beliefs about what's right and wrong. Really, it's right and wrong as it applies to belief in general. And I think if there's one place in the essay that I think his point is put most directly, it's here on, I guess, page 3, where he says, the bottom of this paragraph here, they had no right to believe on such evidence as was before them. And that's interesting because it is conceiving of a right to believe something. And it is hypothetical, where people are being persecuted for some obscure thing that they're being suspected of by others, that the persecutors had no right to believe in the guilt of those people under those conditions. And why did they have no right to believe? Well, because they didn't have the proper evidence. So, generally speaking, it frames the issue of belief in terms of a right to believe. And if you believe in something that you have no right to believe, you are ethically in the wrong. Now, that's quite an interesting way of putting it because, as I said in the study question, don't we have the right to believe whatever we want? And I think that's a very strong instinct that we have, that people have. They have total autonomy over what they believe. They can believe, obviously, whatever they want, and no one should force them to believe anything. I mean, I think that's probably the main point that Burry makes in History of Freedom of Thought, that no one should have the right to enforce belief because belief is a matter of personal conscience. Actually, that's not Burry's argument, but that's an argument. It's a principle that we hold. So why would Clifford say such a thing? That under certain circumstances you have no right to a certain belief. Well, his first examples are ones where we would definitely see his point. The idea of the ship owner. A ship owner was about to send to sea an emigrant ship. He knew that she was old, not over well built at the first, that she had seen many seas and climes and often had needed repairs. Doubts had been suggested to him that possibly she was not seaworthy. These doubts preyed upon his mind and made him unhappy. He thought that perhaps he ought to have her thoroughly overhauled and refitted, even though this should put him to great expense. Before the ship sailed, however, he succeeded in overcoming these melancholy reflections. He said to himself that she had gone safely through so many voyages and weathered so many storms that it was idle to suppose she would not come safely home from this trip also. He would put his trust in Providence, which could hardly fail to protect all these unhappy families that were leaving their fatherland to seek for better times elsewhere. He would dismiss from his mind all ungenerous suspicions about the honesty of builders and contractors. In such ways, he acquired a sincere and comfortable conviction that his vessel was thoroughly safe and seaworthy. He watched her departure with a light heart and benevolent wishes for the success of the exiles in their strange new home that was to be. And he got his insurance money when she went down in mid-ocean and told new tales. Okay, and then he says, well, what shall we say of him? And what we should say of him is that he was wrong, obviously, to send that ship out in that kind of shape, endangering the lives of all those people who were eventually killed. Why was he wrong? Well, he was wrong. Well, I mean, we could say in his defense that he really believed that the ship was safe. And under those conditions, you could say, well, if he believed the ship was safe, then he couldn't have been wrong in letting it go out because he believed it was safe. But Clifford's point is that he had no right to such a belief. That is, that belief was not founded on anything like fact or real evidence. It was founded on wishful thinking and whistling in the dark, you might say. That is, the ship owner convinced himself against his more reasonable doubts that the ship was safe, but for reasons that were not in themselves compelling. So we could say he had no right to that belief. Even if that belief was sincere, it was not arrived at in a sincere way, you might say. His other example is a little bit the one about persecuting the people, um, educational thing, persecuting people on inadequate evidence, which is interesting but weird. But the one about the ship owner is much more straightforward. Um, that is, that he had a sincere belief that the ship was safe, but the way that he arrived at that belief, he had no right to that belief because it was not founded on evidence. It was founded on passion or wishful thinking and things like that. As he says, the end of this paragraph here, the question of right or wrong has to do with the origin of his belief, not the matter of it. Not what it was, but how he got it. Not whether it turned out to be true or false, but whether he had a right to believe on such evidence as was before him. Again, the right to believe. Under these circumstances, the ship owner had no right to believe. And then we have this other one. Now, these cases, he says, are in a certain way set up to be obvious in terms of his point. Um, and the thing about these cases is that the right to believe is not there because that belief harms others. Right? Find where he says that. Uh, that is that these in these two cases, the the people's actions based on the belief, putting people at risk, going to sea or damaging people's reputation, that the you could say that the actions were reckless because they were based upon inadequate evidence, and also that the actions were directly harmful. But does that apply to all beliefs? Uh, it says here, page 5, nor is it that truly a belief at all which has not some influence upon the actions of him who holds it. He who truly believes that which prompts him to an action has looked upon that action to lust after it he has committed already in his heart. If a belief is not realized immediately in open deeds, it is stored up for the guidance of the future. It goes to make a part of that aggregate of beliefs, which is the link between sensation and action in every moment of all our lives, and which is so organized and compacted together that no part of it can be isolated from the rest. But every new addition modifies the structure of the whole. You see what he's doing there is saying that no belief that we have is really insignificant because our beliefs, which he indicates are social, not just private. That is, we share massive amounts of belief just with the rest of society because it's where we were educated, and that each one of our beliefs adds to the structure in some way or another. It affects it, even though it may seem that in itself it's trivial. That's why he says here, No real belief, however trifling and fragmentary it may seem, is ever truly insignificant. It prepares us to receive more of its like, confirms those which resembled it before, and weakens others. And so gradually it lays a stealthy train in our inmost thoughts, which may someday explode into overt action and leave its stamp upon our character forever. So every belief has its place and every belief has an influence. And what he then says is, again, this idea that our beliefs are social and that what we believe affects what others believe. And our beliefs add to the sum of beliefs of human society and so have a great significance. Um, Again, he says, but for as much as no belief held by one man, however seemingly trivial the belief, and however obscure the believer is ever actually insignificant or without its effect on the fate of mankind, we have no choice but to extend our judgment, that a judgment that you have to have a right to believe, to all cases of belief, whatever. That sacred faculty which prompts the decisions of our will and knits into harmonious working all the compacted energies of our being is ours not for ourselves, but for humanity. So it's actually a fateful thing to decide to believe something, and this is where the notion of having a right to believe becomes just a universal thing, that all of our beliefs, we have to earn the right to believe them. That is, we have to believe them on some evidence. And he says this is true for everything, including religion. Right? Here he says there is no exemption for man or for belief, least of all for those great systems of religious belief which have made their deep marks in the history of all human races. He says, if a man holding a belief which he was taught in childhood or persuaded of afterwards keeps down and pushes away any doubts which arise about it in his mind, purposely avoids the reading of books in the company of men that call in question or discuss it, and regards as impious those questions which cannot easily be asked without disturbing it, the life of that man is one long sin against mankind. You know, that definitely recalls Kant, that recalls Bury, the idea that if we suppress our reason, if we just accept things dogmatically, it's not only a personal sin, you may say, it's a sin against mankind. So this notion that we have to earn our beliefs, that there is an ethics of belief, that is wrong to believe something. On inadequate evidence, of course, there's a certain amount of begging the question there because we don't know what we mean by adequate evidence, and he's aware of that. He says on page 7 here towards the end, what is meant by adequate evidence? Right? I mean, we can't just assume that we know what adequate evidence for belief is. That's kind of what this course has been about. We don't know. But he says here, I shall not attempt here to answer this question, which would require us to examine the origin of the two great classes of belief, etc., etc. But for our present purpose, it may suffice to remark that we learn more day by day what evidence does really justify belief. That we learn this by seeking for evidence and being scrupulous about it. Ah, well, that's interesting because he's kind of avoiding the question, but he's saying that maybe it's an attitude rather than a formula for what represents adequate evidence. I don't know. He may be copping out here. I'm not really sure because certainly the question what is meant by adequate evidence is a key question. I don't know. Maybe he's saying again that it's just an attitude rather than a formula. That is, that if you're scrupulous about belief, then you're going to look further, but it still doesn't really help. I don't know. Maybe there's a problem here. There's definitely a problem here. It doesn't. I don't think it wipes out his point, but we'll see what William James has to say because it might.